I rode back into Larkspur Crossing 3 years after the county buried an empty coffin under my own name, and I want to record that the particular strangeness of that homecoming was not simply the shock on people's faces when they recognized me, but the considerably stranger discovery that followed, that the man everyone in that county believed had killed me in the war's final chaotic months had never actually existed at all, a fabrication so carefully constructed and so thoroughly convenient for one particular man's considerable ambition that it had gone entirely unquestioned for 3 full years. My name is Silas Kendrick, and I was 32 years old that particular spring, having spent the better part of 3 years in a prisoner camp so remote and so poorly documented that my own government had apparently concluded, through some combination of clerical error and battlefield confusion, that I had died in a skirmish I had in fact survived, a mistaken report that reached my wife Ruth as official confirmed fact considerably before any correction could properly catch up to it, if any correction had ever actually been attempted at all. The camp itself sat in a stretch of country so remote that mail arrived, when it arrived at all, considerably more sporadically than any of us properly expected, and I had written, I later confirmed, no fewer than 11 letters home during my confinement, none of which, I would eventually learn, had ever reached Ruth or my own family, lost somewhere in the war's considerable administrative chaos, alongside countless other correspondence from men in similarly forgotten camps. I had assumed, those long months, that my own silence toward home was matched by an equal silence from Ruth, unaware that she had already received official word of my death, and had, in the particular way grief demands, begun the long process of properly mourning a husband she believed genuinely gone. If the story I began carefully uncovering that spring proved as deliberately constructed as my growing suspicion suggested, I stood to lose considerably more than simply the awkward business of explaining my own survival to a wife who had, in complete good faith, mourned me properly and eventually remarried. I stood to expose a fraud considerable enough to threaten the standing of one of the county's most respected men, a discovery that would put me in direct, dangerous opposition to Cornelius Vane, who now held both my former ranch and my former wife through means I was only beginning to properly understand. I had enlisted in the spring of that terrible war's 3rd year, leaving Ruth and our modest 200-acre spread in my own father's care, and had been captured during a considerably chaotic retreat 18 months later, spending the remaining war years and some additional months afterward in a prisoner camp whose administration, I would later learn, had been so thoroughly disorganized in the war's final collapse that proper records of surviving prisoners took considerably longer to compile and distribute than anyone in Washington seemed to have anticipated. My own father had died of natural causes during my 2nd year away, a loss I did not learn of until my eventual release. One more piece of the considerable grief that particular war exacted from families regardless of which side of any battle line their sons or husbands actually stood on. The particular cruelty of my situation, I came to understand once I'd properly pieced together the timeline, was that my actual survival had been confirmed to Union authorities within perhaps 4 months of my capture, through a prisoner exchange list that included my name among those confirmed alive and held, but that this confirmation had apparently never properly reached the same administrative channel that had, considerably earlier, and considerably more carelessly, already reported me killed, based on a mistaken identification of another soldier's body wearing similar insignia. 2 entirely separate bureaucratic errors, compounding each other across considerable distance and considerable wartime chaos, had left Ruth mourning a death that was never even accurately reported in the first place, before Vane's own deliberate fabrication arrived to give that false death a specific, convincing shape. I rode into Larkspur Crossing on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, considerably thinner and more weathered than the man who'd ridden out 3 years before, and I want to record that the first person to properly recognize me was old Mrs. Hutchins at the general store, who dropped an entire basket of dry goods at the sight of me, and required several minutes of careful explanation before she could be persuaded I was not in fact a ghost come to settle some unfinished business. I remember standing there in that dusty street, watching flour and dried beans scatter across the boardwalk, understanding for the first time the full particular strangeness of what my return actually represented to people who had spent 3 years genuinely believing me dead and buried, mourned properly at a funeral I had not attended, and could not, by any account, have properly imagined until I stood there watching its considerable aftermath play out in one startled woman's scattered groceries. The unfinished business, as it happened, proved considerably more complicated than any ghost story the county might have preferred instead. I learned, within an hour of my arrival, that Ruth had remarried 2 years before, to Cornelius Vane, the prosperous rancher who had, in the years since my presumed death, acquired my own family spread alongside his existing considerable holdings, expanding his operation into easily the largest in the county through what the townsfolk generally described, with the particular admiring vagueness small towns reserve for their most successful citizens, as shrewd business dealing. I want to record that I received this news standing in the middle of that same dusty street, delivered by a well-meaning shopkeeper who clearly had no idea how to properly soften such an announcement, and that the particular vertigo of learning your own presumed death had reshaped an entire life without your knowledge or consent is not an experience I would wish on any man. However, genuinely I understood, even in that first shocked moment, that Ruth herself bore no blame for decisions made in good faith upon information she had every reason to trust. I want to explain, plainly, the specific story the county had settled on regarding my death, because understanding its particular details is the whole of what eventually exposed its fabrication. The official account, which had apparently reached Ruth through a returning soldier's testimony rather than any proper government notification, held that I had been killed by a specific Confederate soldier during hand-to-hand fighting in the retreat's chaos, a soldier this returning witness described in considerable, oddly specific detail, down to a distinctive scar and a particular regiment insignia. Details that had apparently satisfied everyone's need for a properly concluded story without anyone thinking to verify them against actual military records. I have come to understand, reflecting on it since, that this particular specificity was itself the fabrication's cleverest feature, since a vague account might have invited questions, while a detailed, colorful story satisfied the county's need for narrative closure precisely because it sounded too specific to have been invented. I found Beatrice Lowry, who ran the town's boarding house, considerably more willing to discuss the specific inconsistencies of that story than anyone else I encountered that first difficult week, since most of the county, understandably, preferred simply accepting my survival as a straightforward miracle, rather than properly examining how such a detailed, specific death story could have circulated for 3 years without anyone verifying its actual source. She had, I would learn, offered me a room at her boarding house that first evening entirely out of practical necessity, since my own family's ranch was no longer mine to return to. But our conversation that second evening quickly grew into something considerably more consequential than simple hospitality. I never trusted that account properly, Beatrice told me, on my second evening back, both of us sitting in her boarding house's front parlor, while I attempted to process the considerable weight of everything I'd learned that week. The soldier who supposedly witnessed your death, a man named Corporal Riggs, arrived in this county only briefly, delivered his account to Cornelius Vane directly rather than to your own family first, and left again within days, never available afterward for anyone to properly question further. I found that sequence considerably convenient for a man who then proceeded, within 18 months, to acquire your family's land and eventually your own wife. I want to record that I initially received Beatrice's suspicions with considerable skepticism of my own recent experience having taught me caution about accepting any single account too readily, however plausible. "You're suggesting Vane invented the entire account," I said, working through the considerable implications of what Beatrice was describing. "Paid this Corporal Riggs to deliver a false story, specific enough to be believed, vague enough that the actual soldier supposedly responsible could never be properly traced or questioned." "I'm suggesting exactly that," Beatrice said. "I've had 3 years to consider who actually benefited from your death being believed so thoroughly and so quickly, and I keep arriving at the same name, though I've lacked, until your own return, any particular reason to properly investigate a suspicion that seemed, before your arrival, simply unprovable. A boarding house keeper's private doubts about a respected rancher carry considerably less weight than a returned husband's own direct interest in properly establishing the truth." I spent the following weeks, with Beatrice's considerable help and her own careful local knowledge of the county's various records and personalities, tracing the actual military paperwork surrounding my supposed death, work that eventually led us to a surviving officer from my own regiment, retired now to a considerably distant county, but willing to correspond once Beatrice's careful letters explained the situation properly, who confirmed that no soldier matching the description Corporal Riggs had supposedly given had ever served in the Confederate unit operating in that particular sector during that particular battle, and that no Corporal Riggs himself appeared in any surviving muster rolls of the Union regiment he'd claimed to serve in either. This particular correspondence took the better part of 3 weeks to properly arrive and confirm, weeks during which Beatrice and I spent considerable evenings in her parlor cross-referencing what fragmentary military records the county itself maintained, comparing dates and unit movements against the specific details Corporal Riggs had supposedly provided, a process that required a patience I found I possessed considerably more of than I'd expected. perhaps schooled by 3 years of a prisoner camp's own particular tedium into a capacity for careful, methodical waiting that served this investigation considerably well. However genuinely frustrating those particular weeks of uncertain waiting proved to be for both of us in the moment. The confrontation with Cornelius Vane came on a considerably tense afternoon at his own ranch house, the same house that had once been my own family's modest holding before Vane's acquisition and considerable subsequent expansion, with Beatrice accompanying me at her own insistence rather than mine, since she understood, better than I initially did, that Vane's particular standing in the county required a witness considerably more established than a recently returned soldier whose own sanity half the town still privately questioned. I want to record that walking through the considerably expanded and improved rooms of what had once been my father's modest house produced a particular disorientation in me that I had not properly anticipated, seeing familiar walls transformed by another man's considerable wealth into something I barely recognized. "I understand you've been making inquiries into old military records," Vane said, receiving us in his own front parlor with the particular smooth composure of a man who had clearly anticipated this confrontation eventually arriving and had prepared himself accordingly. "I confess I find your continued presence in this county somewhat troubling, Mr. Kendrick, given the considerable disruption your unexpected survival has already caused to several settled arrangements. I would think a man returning from such considerable hardship might prefer rebuilding quietly, rather than pursuing accusations against his neighbors." "I'd think a fabricated account of my death would trouble you considerably more," I said, "given what I've since confirmed about Corporal Riggs and his entirely fictional military service. Perhaps you'd care to explain how a soldier who never served in either army came to deliver such a specific, detailed account of my supposed death directly to you." Something in Vane's careful composure shifted, though considerably less dramatically than I'd anticipated, the particular controlled reaction of a man who had clearly prepared himself for exactly this accusation and had some manner of response already rehearsed. "Fictional soldiers and misremembered regiments are hardly uncommon in the considerable chaos that war produced," he said. "I paid a considerable sum to a traveling man who claimed knowledge of your fate, Mr. Kendrick, and had no particular means of verifying his account beyond his own confident testimony. If his story proves fabricated, the fault lies with his deception, not my own reasonable acceptance of information I had no cause to doubt at the time." "You delivered that account to Ruth yourself," Beatrice said, "before any government notification arrived, and you acquired the Kendrick spread within 18 months of doing so, at a price I've since confirmed through the county land office was considerably below its actual value, from a widow with no particular leverage to negotiate otherwise. I find your reasonable acceptance considerably more calculated than you're presenting it, Mr. Vane, and I suspect a proper judge would find the same, once these particulars are laid out plainly before him." Vane did not confess outright that first confrontation, maintaining instead a careful, plausible account of innocent misfortune that I want to record was considerably more difficult to definitively disprove than either Beatrice or I had initially hoped, since proving Riggs's fabrication did not, by itself, prove Vane had commissioned that fabrication rather than simply been an unwitting recipient of it, a distinction that mattered considerably in any eventual legal proceeding, whatever our own private certainty about which explanation actually held true. The proof that eventually settled the matter came through Beatrice's own careful persistence, tracing a payment from Vane's own bank records to an account belonging to a man matching Riggs's general description, made 3 weeks before Riggs's supposed testimony reached Larkspur Crossing, a timeline that made Vane's account of innocent, unverified acceptance considerably harder to sustain once presented properly to the county circuit judge. Beatrice had spent several patient afternoons cultivating a cautious friendship with a junior clerk at the county bank, a young man who eventually, after considerable careful persuasion regarding the genuine injustice at stake, permitted her a discreet review of certain transaction records that would ordinarily have remained entirely confidential. Ruth, I want to record, learned the full truth of Vane's fabrication alongside the rest of the county, and I watched something considerable move across her face when the timeline of that payment was properly explained in the judge's own chambers, a recognition that her second marriage had been built, from its very foundation, on a deliberately constructed lie, rather than the simple tragic misfortune she had genuinely believed she was navigating in good faith. Judge Ashford, who presided over that particular hearing, noted for the record that the timeline evidence alone, quite apart from any question of Corporal Riggs's fabricated identity, established a pattern of deliberate deception considerable enough to warrant formal criminal proceedings against Vane, rather than any simple civil restitution. "I mourned you honestly," she told me, some days after the full truth had properly settled into the county's understanding, both of us sitting in a considerably more careful, formal conversation than our marriage had once required. Whatever else Vane arranged, My grief was genuine, Silas, and I want you to understand that before anything else gets decided about what happens now. I wept at your grave for months, real tears, and I do not want the discovery of Vane's deception to somehow cheapen a grief that felt entirely true while I was living through it. I believe you, I said, and I want to record that I meant it entirely, understanding, by that point, that Ruth had been as thoroughly deceived by Vane's construction as the rest of the county, a victim of his fabrication rather than any willing participant in it. None of what happened afterward changes the fact that you genuinely lost a husband you believed dead, Ruth, and genuinely grieved him properly. I hold no anger toward you for what followed that grief, whatever complications it's since created for both of us. Ruth and I did not resume our marriage. In the end, both of us having changed considerably in 3 years of separation neither of us had chosen, and both of us, I think, recognizing that the particular life we'd built together belonged now to a version of ourselves the war and its considerable aftermath had irrevocably altered. She eventually settled in a neighboring county, with a modest settlement from Vane's confiscated assets, and I understand she has found, in the years since, a quieter contentment than our own marriage, however genuinely loving, had properly offered her. Cornelius Vane was convicted of fraud that same year, the county land office restoring my family's original spread to my name once the full extent of his fabricated purchase was properly established, and I want to record that the considerable satisfaction of watching a genuinely dangerous, calculating man finally answer for what he'd constructed did not fully account for the 3 years his lie had actually cost me. Years I could not properly recover regardless of how thoroughly justice eventually caught up to their architect. Vane received a considerable prison sentence, his once respected standing in the county collapsing entirely within weeks of the conviction, several of his own business partners quietly distancing themselves from any prior association once the full scope of his fabrication became public knowledge. Beatrice and I did not marry hastily, both of us understanding, after everything we'd uncovered together, the particular value of taking proper time to be certain about important decisions rather than rushing toward convenient conclusions, however genuinely we'd come to care for each other during those difficult investigative weeks. We courted properly through that following winter, the county watching our slowly developing relationship with the particular interested attention small towns reserve for anything following such a dramatic public reckoning. And I found, by spring, that I had no remaining doubt whatsoever about the rightness of asking her to share the considerable rebuilding still ahead of me on my restored family land. We were married that following spring, in a small ceremony at the same ranch house Vane had once occupied, our small congregation of guests including several of the same townsfolk who had once whispered doubts about my own sanity during those first difficult weeks of my return, now considerably more willing to celebrate a resolution none of them had properly anticipated when I first rode back into Larkspur Crossing looking, by most accounts, considerably more like a ghost than a groom. I never trusted convenient stories, Beatrice told me, one evening on our own porch some months into our marriage. Long before I had any particular reason to distrust this specific one. I find that particular skepticism has served me considerably well, Silas, in ways I don't believe I properly appreciated until you rode back into this county and gave that skepticism something genuinely worth investigating. She looked out at the same land Vane had once claimed as his own considerable prize, now restored and properly ours together. I've run that boarding house alone for 6 years, listening to every traveler's story with a particular careful attention for what didn't quite add up. I never expected that particular habit would eventually lead me here. I still keep the old military discharge papers that eventually confirmed my survival, filed alongside the county land office's restoration of my family's original spread, in the same drawer where my father once kept our homestead's founding documents, and some evenings, working that same restored land alongside Beatrice, I understand more clearly each year that the truest danger a community ever faces is not the lie itself, but the particular collective comfort of never bothering to properly question a story convenient enough that everyone involved would rather simply believe it. We raised our own family on that same restored land in the years that followed, and I made certain, whenever either of our children asked how their parents first came to know each other, to tell the story properly. The empty grave, the fabricated soldier, and the boarding house keeper who refused to simply accept a convenient story without first asking who exactly benefited from everyone believing it.